Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are live with episode 5, I believe, of the all-time high Web3 Forum. Today I'm super happy to have Joe Vu with me, co-founder of Multiconomy, a project building on Multiverse X, also the CTO in a more traditional company. We'll maybe learn a little bit about that. Today we are going to talk about Web3 and kind of the fundamentals, go over how that is different from what the traditional Web 2 space looks like, discuss a little bit about the implications, but we're just going to try to kind of focus on what makes Web 3 different and what makes it exciting and why we're in it and why we're building on it. So first of all, welcome to the show, Joe.
Thank you, Lucas. Thanks for having me. It's super exciting to be on here and talking to everyone about our topic today.
I'm the inspiration to this to let everyone kind of in on how this came about, because we obviously have very different guests on the show. Um,
Mm.
is that we started? I read one of your threads, and that was kind of covering all the fundamentals. And I've been looking to kind of do that for the show, as we've been covering high level stuff and some more of the nitty gritty stuff like specific gaming and art and all of these things. But I thought take a step back and really kind of dive in what the fundamentals really are, why they're interesting, and what's different, so we can go back then and dive deeper into it. And this is actually just the first part of something we've been planning out as well. Today we'll really try to keep it pretty basic, entry level, although we will discuss some of the implications of all this cool entry level stuff. But then we'll dive into some more detail in future episodes. So I'm super happy to have someone so competent guide us in this. And yeah, looking forward to what you have to say. We'll start with a quick presentation by Joe. He'll say a little bit about himself. He'll cover the basics, and then we'll have a conversation. And at any point, please feel free. I see the YouTube chat. I see some of the other chats. I have some of my own questions, of course, but feel free to chime in. This is an open forum. This is a forum for discussion. We're just here to get this started. So if you have any thoughts, comments, questions at any time, please let us know. And so, yeah, without further ado, Joe, take it away.
Awesome. So I'll share my screen and then I'll introduce a little bit about myself. So as Lucas did a pretty good job of describing me at a high level, I do have a technical background. I have been in Web 2 for quite a number of years, coming up to 20 if I remember correctly. And that's typically where we all start with Web 2, and then we transition to Web 3. I run several businesses, Multiconomy being one of them, an initiative, a Web3 first initiative and company, and we at the moment building on Multiverse X and leveraging the powerful technology to deliver both B2B and B2C solutions and services. Um, Also, in my traditional world, we are increasingly focusing on bridging the gap between Web 2 and Web 3 and seeing how enterprises are able to come on board and actually utilize this great technology to their benefit. So we are involved in a lot of management consulting, also a lot of traditional tech where we can actually try and see if we can leverage the power of Web3 at the same time as AI, which we've all heard of, and how we can actually work inside Web3 and the ESG side of things to make sure that the environment is a little bit better for the generations to come. So
Just,
coming back to this. education.
Joe, just one interruption here. The ESG stuff and
Sure.
all the abbreviations, always good to just briefly explain maybe the concept behind that as well.
Sure. So ESG is very much about the environment, the social and the governance of enterprises and organizations, how they actually collectively drive those very broad initiatives. And when we hear ESG, we often think about a lot about environment, but there is a lot of other components in there, although environment is actually one of the main drivers of ESG pillars, and how we can actually then integrate that into Web3 is really an interesting topic where a lot of big enterprises are exploring at the moment. So hopefully that gives a background on what ESG is and why ESG is relevant to Web3. So coming back to uh, to our presentation today and our topic, what I'm going to present to you guys today is somewhat of a high level overview on what Web3 is, how you can get from Web 2 to Web3, what the differences are between the two. And we are really going to just keep it extremely simple today. And we're not going to go too much into technical, although we are going to go down the route of Multiverse X and explore that a little bit. But that is pretty much of the depth of the conversation that we're having. So just a quick overview of what we're going to touch on today. So we're going to first talk about what blockchain is, what Web3 is, why it's here. Then we're actually going to talk about a little bit about Multiverse X and what it's doing currently, why it's good, and where are some of the weaknesses, both in Multiverse X and in the Web3 space. We're going to touch on how we're going to get started, how you can actually dive into Web3 and experience what Web3 has to offer. Obviously, there's always going to be areas where we need to be careful about, so we're going to touch on that towards the end. And there is a bonus bit about a big difference between Web3 and Web2 and why community is very important to Web3. Web3 is an umbrella term. If you think about Web2, it doesn't really, if you refer to Web2, it doesn't really refer to anything in particular, more like, hey, it's a combination of technology that came together to then facilitate the web as we know it today. Web3 is very much the same. When we think about Web3, we kind of zoom into, oh, it's about crypto, it's about, blockchain, but it can be a lot more about the surrounding technologies that make blockchain, that make cryptocurrencies true today. So it is something that is quite broad, and we just got to be careful that we don't zoom Web3 right into, hey, it's about Bitcoin, it's about cryptocurrency, because that is a dangerous thing to have when we're actually referring to something that is a lot broader. So when we come to Web3, one of the graphs or illustrations which we may or may not be familiar with, as you can see from the slide, is how we've evolved from where we came from Web 1, as we call it, to Web 2 to Web 3. In some simplistic terms, Web 1 is a lot more about consumption, about reading, not so much about interaction, because of the limitations of technology in the era of Web 1. We don't know if you all remember, but we used to have our phones and gone to websites that we call web, where we just basically read a lot of web pages, very, very limited information, but information exchange is possible, and loading of pages of information, of imagery That's where Web 1 was. Web 2 is very much about interaction. It's about, engaging in socials. It's about Facebook. It's about Instagram. It's about WhatsApp as we know it today. Google, Amazon, where you can actually buy stuff, where you can actually sell stuff. So it's about posting, it's about giving, it's also about consumption. So there is a level of interaction with Web 2 that we did not have in Web 1. Come to today, where we are with Web 3, we have an additional very, very important element in addition to what was already in Web 1 and Web 2. And that is the ability to have some ownership of your data, of the things that you actually are interacting with. So with the likes of Facebook and Twitter, which is now referred to as X, we did not have the ability to be able to own the data that we are sharing or posting. And that is because it is centralized to the providers that are providing the service. So Web3 very much facilitates decentralization, which we're going to come on to later in the slides, but also ownership. So giving users the ability to own what they're sharing. So three very important aspects of Web3. Decentralization, you're able to verify things on chain, on the blockchain, and the ownership aspects of Web3. So those three things are very, very important pillars to Web3 as we know it today. So what is Web3 actually doing? Underlying all the things that we've said in the previous two slides, what it's actually doing is it is shifting the trust from intermediaries that are centralized to many intermediaries that are decentralized. So basically shifting the trust from, in a way, from governments to the people, or from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google to people. So the paradigm shift that's important that we need to know about Web3 is that it's shifting the trust from traditional Web2 centralized format into a decentralized people community-based mechanism. So that's the underlying paradigm shift which Web3 is trying to facilitate as of today. One of the very, very common misconceptions of Web3 and blockchain is that a lot of people come into the Web3 field and they immediately think that blockchain is Bitcoin and Bitcoin is blockchain. And that is something that is understandable. However, it's also something that is quite untrue. Bitcoin is actually facilitated by the technology of blockchain. But blockchain can actually be used in many, many places, and Bitcoin is only one of them. And cryptocurrency, broadly speaking, also is only one of the areas where blockchain can actually be used. There are a lot of other places where blockchain can actually be utilized that may or may not relate to cryptocurrencies. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. So we'll dive a little bit into Multiverse X, which is one of many, many blockchains that are around today and that are actually actively building the foundations and the technology and the adoption of Web3 and collectively within the Web3 space, pushing the boundaries of what blockchain and the surrounding technologies of Web3 can actually do for us in our everyday lives. A little bit about Multiverse X. It used to be called The ticker used to be called ERD. That was pre-2020. When we refer to a ticker, it's basically just the code, the 3-letter, 4-letter, 5-letter code that refers to the underlying cryptocurrency that we're referring to. So today we know the cryptocurrency of Multiverse X as eGold, which was introduced in 2022. There was a major rebrand from Multiverse X, which was formerly Elrond pre-2022. They are Romanian, and what makes eGold somewhat similar, although unique in many other places, but somewhat similar to Bitcoin, is that it does have a max supply of just over 31 million, and it uses a consensus mechanism called secure proof of stake, which we will get into in later episodes. It is a pretty technical term. However, it is useful to know that every blockchain has a consensus mechanism which determines whether each transaction is legitimate. So the potentials of Multiverse X is basically factoring in everything that they've done is the underlying technology, which will then drive adoption and then drive the market cap increase, which will then circle back around to building more technology adoption and also the growth that comes from that. So the three fundamental pillars of Multiverse X as we see it is its ability to scale and the performance that it outputs in terms of its efficiency, heavily based on its scalability, and also the product suite which the internal Multiverse X team is actually building. A lot of the time I see Multiverse X as something that is quite similar in a way to how Apple is actually trying to push its ecosystem, whereby it's actually got its whole vertical suite to go with its horizontal infrastructure. So when I see Multiverse X, I see a much smaller version, but a smaller version of what Apple has built for itself in the 20 years leading up to its success that it has at the moment. So technology, and this is not really kind of restricted to Multiverse X, but actually all the blockchains in the Web3 space, is that the technological foundation is really the stronghold and the cornerstone of the growth of each platform and ecosystem. Multiverse X is no different. It has particularly strong foundations, as you can see if you dive into the ecosystem. It does have a whole product suite and a strong community behind it as well, even in the bear market that we are experiencing right now. So it is important also with talking about the strengths to also talk about the weaknesses that we may be able to pick out in both in Web3, also specifically in Multiverse X. As you may or may not know, Web3 is very young, and with its relatively young age, we have a higher risk of regulatory compliance from different governments around the world that are trying to understand and regulate this space. It is quite a tricky thing because cryptocurrencies are a somewhat different and new asset class to our traditional finance. Therefore, we also need the bridging mechanisms to be able to bridge what we had in Web 2 to what we now have in Web 3. And from they are commonly known as exchanges, where you can actually on-ramp your fiat and basically buy cryptocurrency, then transfer it out to your respective wallets. The third very important concept of risk that we have here is that I see a lot of cryptocurrencies and blockchain ecosystems that are very, very much becoming centralized. And that may or may not be their intention. However, that is one of the risks and dangers to shortcutting the decentralization and shortcutting our way to Web3 is having too much centralization in Web3, which then defeats the main purpose and the main fundamentals of what Web3 stands for. So that is something that we really need to watch out for as one of the risks as we progress into our journey deeper into Web3 in the years to come. Specific to Multiverse X, there are several risks that we need to be watchful about. Team centralization is one of them, and Multiverse X is known to output really great products. However, they are doing a lot of things. As you can see from the illustration on the left, there is a lot of products either in the pipeline or live already, but still need maintenance and upkeep. So that is one thing that we need to be watchful about and ensure that they're not overutilizing and exhausting their resources. In terms of CeFi exposure, let me just briefly explain CeFi. CeFi is what we refer to as exchanges or centralized finance, such as Binance, Coinbase, to name the two that are the biggest in the world. Multiverse X does have exposure, direct exposure to Binance. It was actually a Binance launchpad. In terms of the underlying exposure, I believe that Binance does hold quite a big portion of eGold, which is the underlying cryptocurrency of Multiverse X. So there is a considerable exposure there that we need to be aware of in assessing our risks. There is geographical centralization with Multiverse X as well. And where I am at the moment and where Multiconomy is based in Australia, there is very, very little Multiverse X presence. Asia, very much the same. So geographical centralization is one of the things that we need to also be constantly wary about, and hopefully Multiverse X will address this in the near future. Adoption exposure is one of the barriers which Multiverse X is hitting at the moment, and also Web3 in general. We have really great underlying tech. We need to make sure that the exposure is there so that the adoption can be driven. And there are several ways to do that, but that is definitely one of the risks of Multiverse X and Web3 in general. So individually, if we are investing into the Web3 world, it is very important to ensure that you understand what risks are presented to you, what risks may not be visible but are actually there. And hopefully in the last two slides, we've covered some of the high-level things that you should be looking out for. So in terms of Web3, we've covered quite a lot of things in the previous slides, but what I personally like to do is to also ensure that there is an angle to where you can actually start. And where better to start than to introduce a little bit about Multiverse X and how you can actually get into, get your hands dirty, if you like, and set up something that actually you can play around with. So one of the very important fundamentals which we must understand even before we start is what we mean by custodial and non-custodial wallets. So in order to facilitate ownership of assets, of data in Web3, which we've covered in previous slides, we need what we call wallets to be able to hold those assets. And the wallets are divided into, broadly speaking, two categories, custodial and non-custodial. Strictly speaking, the custodial ones are really not wallets because they're not really in your custody. However, we'll refer them as basically the two categories. The big difference between custodial and non-custodial we'll cover in the following slides, but very important to get your head around what the differences are, where you can actually buy or acquire e-gold, the utility of e-gold, and just a little bit about the exporter wallet. So let's dive in on the custody side of the wallet. So custodial wallets are wallets that actually you don't own. So think of exchanges akin to banks in the traditional finance world. Banks hold your money. So theoretically speaking, you don't have custody to your money. You can use it, but it sits in the bank. It doesn't sit with you. So exchanges are very much like banks, where they actually hold your funds. That's why a lot of Web3 education is about moving assets off exchanges for safekeeping. Because when assets are on exchanges, you are again dependent on a centralized third party to safeguard your assets, which is counterintuitive to what Web3 is about. However, exchanges are extremely important because that is the crucial bridge between Web2 and Web3. We have software wallets like the Exporter app, where you have and you safekeep your own seed phrase. So this is a very important concept because if you have your seed phrase and you keep it safe, then you have your assets always safe and in custody yourself. Both software and hardware wallets facilitates this, but the most important thing you need to understand is that seed phrase is basically the asset. So if you lose your seed phrase or if the seed phrase is compromised, then your assets are compromised. With exchanges and the custody solution, you don't have access to the seed phrase, and therefore the assets are not in your custody. Now, there are pros and cons to both. However, in the Web3 world, the non-custodial solutions, i.e. the hardware and the software wallets where you custody the assets yourself, that is really where the core value of Web3 is in terms of facilitating ownership. In terms of acquisition of not just e-gold, but broadly speaking, cryptocurrency, they are the easiest to acquire on exchanges. You do need to what we call KYC, and KYC is commonly known as an abbreviation to know your customer. That process is basically identifying you a little bit like when you are wanting to open a bank account. You can't just open it online without providing any ID, right? So you need to be able to provide your ID and provide your geographical location with your proof of address in order to acquire cryptocurrency exchanges, cryptocurrency on exchanges. In terms of the utility of e-gold, but also more broadly speaking, the utility of cryptocurrency, which follows a very, very similar pattern. It is a native currency of Multiverse X blockchain, the e-gold cryptocurrency. It does have an element of scarcity because it does have limited supply, and it does facilitate the ecosystem transactions and trading of what we call NFTs, which is non-fungible tokens. Again, we'll get into that in later courses because they are a little bit more advanced in terms of concept, and also ESDTs, which are tokens within the Multiverse X blockchain, which basically sits on top of the blockchain, and e-gold being the native currency to facilitate the trade between all those different tokens that are within the blockchain itself. As you may have heard of, the Exporter app, which is a software wallet by Multiverse X, is self-custody or non-custodial, meaning that it is a good starting point to your Web3 journey in terms of experiencing what it's like to actually custody your own assets and safekeep your seed phrase from intermediaries like the exchanges. We'll cover a little bit more about how you actually can set up and the steps involved in setting up the Exporter app in later 102s and 103 courses to come. So we've highlighted the importance of seed phrases and why they equate to your assets being either safe or compromised. So always ensure if you are setting up either a hardware or software wallet that is self-custodial, that you absolutely must keep your seed phrases very safe. In terms of the inner workings of blockchain, one of the concepts that we must also be very familiar with is how blockchain is immutable. Immutability refers to the inability to modify records in the past. So with a bank, it's extremely easy to reverse a transaction because the bank holds the database of ledger or ledgers to enable the reversal of any transaction in a centralized place. Whereas the blockchain has what we call a consensus mechanism, whereby a lot of different parties need to agree in order for any transaction to proceed as a legitimate one. Because of this mechanism, it is impossible or very close to impossible unless the blockchain is very centralized. It is very close to impossible to then reverse a transaction. So how does this apply to, at a high level concept? If you send someone some Bitcoin, some e-gold, some asset, it is almost impossible to retrieve it back if it was sent by mistake. So that is something that we must also be aware of when we are operating in the Web3 blockchain space with assets that are valuable, is that we must make sure that assets, transactions that we are trying to make are actually what we confirmed we want to make, and we are absolutely sure that we want to make that operation because there is essentially no going back once that's made. So one of the last sections that we want to cover quickly today is why we have the community aspect in Web3 and why it's so important. So in traditional Web2 companies and projects, community is not something that is fundamental to nurture in Web2. Web3 is a lot different whereby we are community first, and projects are generally community first. They build the community and they bring the community together on this common goal and common value, and a common journey to then either succeed or fail together. And that is basically, I am speaking the truth that there is going to be a lot of projects that will fall before we find a group of projects that will succeed in the long term. So Web3 is very much about bringing the community together, and for founders to actually have that opportunity and the core team to have that opportunity to nurture the community and to then, through active, consistent communication, drive adoption and also drive the growth of the project together with the community. So everyday people like us are able to then hop onto the journey and basically with the founders side by side to ensure that both Web3 and the project, the underlying project that the community is driving is or has the best possible chance to succeed in its endeavors. So with that, I thank you for giving me this time and also opportunity to, present to you a very high level Web3 101 course, which I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks, Lucas.
Thank you, Joe. I love that photo of you in the end. That's very cute. Um, yeah, thank you so much. There was a lot really covered, and I want to take like the last about 20 minutes or so to dive a little bit deeper into some of these concepts because I think it's important, like we cover the basics and then we can really have a conversation about what that actually means in practice. But before we really dive into this, you kind of mentioned like getting people started in Web3 and like buying the first Eagle or buying the first Bitcoin, etc. How did you end up in this space? What is your kind of journey into this, and maybe relate it back to like how that's different from other people, or where you found obstacles also like getting into the space, and you just take us on that journey.
Sure. So I guess my journey was very, very similar to a lot of people. Initially heard about Bitcoin, and we all hear about Bitcoin first, and we hear about Bitcoin here, Bitcoin there, and then I had a very strong misconception at the start, actually, that Bitcoin was useless. It was environmentally unfriendly, and all that compute power could actually be doing something else. And whether in the medical field trying to solve, I don't know, cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever, something that is more meaningful than to compute a mathematical equation that really has no, at that time I thought has no value, right? But as you kind of put a little bit of money into it, because you need the skin in the game, right? So you put a little bit of money into it, and you have some skin in the game. You go, okay, well, what do we know about this actually? Are my misconceptions right? And then you start digging and you start verifying whether what you heard is right or whether it's just the media talking about things in an exaggerated way. And you start to realize, and this is, I guess, one of those high level things which I thought I wish I knew sooner, is that what Bitcoin is doing is actually gathering energy and tokenizing energy. So yes, it is very, very power hungry, energy hungry, But if you think of it another way, it's basically uh, holding that value of energy into a tokenized format, which is then the BTC that as we know it today. And then you're able to trade that energy, and that energy is proofed by the consumption of power. So I wish I'd known this earlier, but that was basically when I had the moment of, okay, I think I understand this now. So then when you understand the fundamentals of what Bitcoin is trying to do and why and how it's decentralized, why it's decentralized, then you can have that concept, then apply it into other different blockchains and cryptocurrencies as well, and then you can benchmark it and see what's different. So that's been basically my journey, and I'm still actively doing that. Having the fundamentals of Bitcoin and how that compares to Multiverse X, for example, and where is it similar, where is it different. So I think that's a very, very interesting concept to have, and a very powerful concept to have to ensure that we get into the Web3 uh, kind of area for the right reasons.
Yeah, that's a fascinating concept. Actually, never heard that or thought about it. Bitcoin as tokenized energy. That's that's something I'll take away. And I thought I had the 101 kind of covered, but that's certainly a really interesting thought. I also like you mentioned something that I think is super important because that's also how I started my journey in this. It's this kind of skin in the game, and I was thinking during your presentation this sort of how do we broaden the ecosystem? How do we invite new people in? How do we get to a point where it's not so much about the about Bitcoin as an investment, but blockchain as infrastructure, right? It's like two
Mhm.
fundamentally different realms and really two
Yes.
fundamentally different groups that we're talking to. And I think the skin in the game
Hmm.
is super interesting because that's exactly my journey too, like buying Bitcoin and then being like, what the fuck did I just buy and why was it so complicated to buy it? And like what's behind it? And like I'd love your thoughts on this kind of how do we get people to have skin in the game? Are there certain things that you feel like are lacking in the space at the moment? How can we actually incentivize people to buy that first Satoshi or buy that first e-gold or something? How do we get people interested in the technology?
I think that does take a little bit of time. And when we go too fast, we experience bubbles, like we have experienced, a couple of times in the past. And don't get me wrong, they are necessary in terms of adoption. But I would rather a much more sustained approach and sustained way where we grow a long period of time, but at a slower rate. And I think one of the things which, funnily enough, we mentioned in the presentation is the concept of seed phrase. And that I think is actually quite a big barrier because if you think about the savvy Web3 people that are listening to this right now, you'll probably relate. Where do you keep your seed phrase? Do you keep it, in a digital vault that's like 1Password or a similar Bitwarden? Do you keep it in there? Is it safe? Or do you keep it, I don't know, lying on your desk on a piece of paper? Do you then write it down and store in a bank, which is a bit odd because you're trying to get away from the bank, but then you store your seed phrase in the bank. It's one of those things where we need to actually find a very intelligent way to be able to incentivize the masses to come where they don't have to worry about the seed phrase, whilst also giving them the opportunity to self-custody. So that's one of the biggest barriers I believe at the moment is that people either keep it on exchanges, and that's why we've had so many problems with exchanges, is that it has a big holding, and people don't realize the risk related to keeping funds on exchanges. It's just that's similar to banks, except exchanges are so much smaller than banks and so much more illiquid to the bank in terms of volume. Therefore, it is inherently quite dangerous. But then if you take the seed phrase, where do you put it? Do you put it in your memory, which is again not absolutely safe, or do you just have it lying around somewhere? And what if someone takes it? What if the house gets burnt down? Then you've lost your seed phrase. And we've heard many of those stories before, which is why a lot of Bitcoins are lost because they're in hard drives that have been chucked out into the garbage or lost forever. So I think that's where the biggest barrier to adoption at the moment is for the average Joe. Is that they don't want the hassle of what is this 25 word thing that I have to keep supposedly secret, but it's just plain words, and they don't realize the importance of the combination of those 20, 25 words, and what seed phrase it actually is. So I think that is one of the things that someone will solve. And in the long term, what I see is that we don't talk about uh, which chain we're on. I think that's technical talk. That's definitely technical talk. And at the end of the day, in Web2, we don't care about when we type in google.com or, whichever website you want to go to, you don't immediately think, oh, what server is it hosted on? Or, how is it hosted? What's the underlying technology? You just want to see the website and you want to browse the website, consume content, maybe post something, right? You want to interact with it, but you don't really care about where it is hosted, how the domain translates into IP. It's all technical talk. So with blockchain, we're still at a stage where we're asking, what chain are you on? What chain are you on? Are you going to be multi-chain soon? And that's all technical talk. Towards the maturing stages of Web3, I believe that it's just going to be basically one big infrastructure, and it's intelligent enough to determine what chain is the most suitable for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I also have to say, like, this kind of carelessness with the seed phrase, just because you lack a very basic understanding, and even
Mm.
for people who have this general understanding, there's still a lack of care, just because it's so hard to
Yeah,
care about a piece of paper or a vault or something like that, because it's always abstract, the danger of losing your money. And so
mm.
I totally agree. I think that's really one of the main obstacles there. Basically, Kevin also agreeing in the chat. Also, we have about 10-15 more minutes, so shoot your questions if you have anything in particular. I also wanted, in terms of adoption, you mentioned like regulations as maybe a threat, but perhaps also an opportunity for the space, just kind of grappling with this new kind of asset class that governments around the world have to deal with in
Mm.
some way, because their citizens are putting money into it, and they probably are
Yeah.
interested in that money. How do you like see that evolution in kind of the law surrounding cryptocurrencies and blockchain at large? Where do you see that like go in the next few years?
I think we are at a critical kind of crossroad between uh, the decentralization part of Web3 that's made basically decentralizing a lot of things possible. And one of those things is obviously certain things in governments and what governments are trying to do as well with money and monetary policy. So it is quite interesting because governments are struggling at the moment to regulate and to, I guess, in a certain extent, contain cryptocurrencies, especially the likes of Bitcoin, which is very, very decentralized. It's a lot easier with others because they're a lot more centralized. However, it's people, I think people are starting to realize that, hey, what we have in US dollar and euro is not it's basically a representation of value, but it's not really backed by anything. So that's one of the fundamentals that people are slowly coming to realization. In the future, I do think that money as we know it right now will still exist in the form of CBDC. And CBDC is another interesting topic, central bank digital currency. It's what all governments are trying to do at the moment. There is a big downside to CBDC though, and that is that they will have full control, even more control than cash over what you do with your money, and they can actually seize your money extremely easily because of technology, because it's inherently it's digital. So every single dollar, euro, they're able to control, and they're trying to basically assert power on that to ensure that they have still that control mechanism. Um, but the interesting thing is we've got this CBDC on one end, and then we've got also digital, but digital assets, as we know, it's like Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies in the other end. The good thing is that they can interact, they should be able to interact very easily. So tradable in terms of interaction, a lot easier than on-ramping at the moment with traditional currency. However, there is going to be a lot more control mechanism based to CBDC. So it's going to be very interesting, and it's very hard to tell exactly what's going to happen in the future, but it's going to be interesting to see the dynamic of how the CBDCs will interact with the existing cryptocurrency assets and how they can actually, through CBDC and other policies that they introduce, and to actually then regulate the cryptocurrency space, and keep us safe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like every kind of horror movie and these future dystopian things are all about how we have a chip implanted and
Yeah.
the government basically has full control over how we spend our money, what we
Mm.
can spend our money on, etc. Which is again, I mean, like all of these things as we see with basically pushing people into gray legal gray areas by
Yeah.
making totally normal things questionable. Is there is a huge illicit market that thrives of exactly that and capitalizes and actually makes people less safe, even though that might seem counterintuitive. That's an interesting
Yeah.
aspect. I also wanted to touch, like you mentioned, this kind of adoption thing, and I wanted to talk about this kind of skin in the game on the other side, because I know that you
Mm.
both professionally and like personally are all about this kind of bridging people, and you talked a lot about how to make Web3 seamless, and basically the experience doesn't matter so much, like it's just the technology that stuff is built on. I also wanted to like pick your brain a little bit about where you see like natural use cases for Web3. What do you think the first kind of successful things built on Web3 will be? Like, where do you see? You mentioned community and how to integrate that. Are there tools that you see specifically, either be it on the community side or just on like your everyday kind of programs that could be that just make more sense in Web3? Where do you see those bridges being built? And yeah, how do you see that fitting in? Talk about NFTs if you want, or some kind of art, or
Mm.
emotional connection, skin in the game. Yeah, where are these bridges, and what are they?
Yeah, I think they can kind of be split into two paths, but there's basically what enterprises are trying to do, and that's also very interesting because it'll come around to impact uh, all the everyday individuals in how we interact and use applications as we know it today. So enterprises are doing a lot of things in their background to facilitate Web3. But individuals, more interestingly, are also coming from bottom up. And that's the beauty with Web3 is that anyone can kind of dive in and either have some skin in the game or be part of the community and uh, and chuck something there and see it grow or fail. Um, so it the obviously the barrier is what we've talked about is okay, what is a wallet and how do I custody my seed phrase? And we can bypass that a little bit with currently with exchanges. And we can get in very easily just by after we KYC. We can actually then have an account where we can, to a certain extent, in some places also hold NFTs in the exchanges and ensure that, it's, I guess, as safe as it can be if you are not confident with the seed phrase custody. But the beauty with Web3 is that whether it's through NFT or it's through um, cryptocurrencies like ESDTs on Multiverse X, you're able to, uh, I guess, at the moment, without too much regulation, but regulation will come, you're able to then have the skin in the game. And when you have the skin in the game, it also means that you have the motivation to and the responsibility in a way to try and grow that particular project or ecosystem. And that is a very powerful concept to have. Whereas in Web 2, in comparison, it would be like, I want to buy some shares, right? Or stocks. And that has its complexities and also is quite rigid in its approach. It's very regulated, very rigid. Web3 is a lot more free flowing, and that might also be because it's not so regulated yet. But we must also not forget that Web3 is fun. So with NFTs, it's we're also enjoying it. We're having fun, and it's the experience of being part of something. I think that is inherently really, really important. The ownership. So it would be very different if you were to just create an account and wallets didn't exist, and then people send you a JPEG on your account. I mean that it doesn't quite gel the same as if you actually have custody of something, you actually really own it. And I think if we step back a little bit, um, we are all searching for something that uh, we can own or we can actually have a legacy to pass on to. So the custody and the ownership of Web3, I think is a lot more powerful than what people are thinking because subconsciously people are looking for what is real ownership? Is it having $1 million in your account? Maybe not, because is that really your money? Or is it the government's money? And are they debasing that money because they're printing more, right? So how can you hold that value? How can you actually grow that value? And is it actually yours? So that concept, I think, drives Web3 and will drive it a lot further. And the ownership side of things, the holding the value, um, and also the ease of anybody you know, from the bottom as in the end users can actually come on and be part of a project or an ecosystem and actively play a role in it, have some responsibility as well as ownership. there are no other areas at the moment that can beat that.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, coming back to the skin of the game, skin in the game, having skin in the game, having some financial skin in the game, even if it's not too much, but if it's something, then it also drives that responsibility and that obligation, optional obligation, if you like, to then, hey, I want this thing to grow because the success of it is also the success of what I've put in. So that's where I think skin in the game comes in, and where I think is really important.
Yeah, that's going to be an exciting kind of segment in one of the next, I think, episodes to really dive into this kind of how does the really conception of ownership change how we interact with basically anything once we own a piece of it
Yeah.
in whatever way. How does that change the way that we interact with it? So that's super exciting. We're at the hour mark. I will tell you that I just learned something else from the chat, which is that you apparently need to advise Australia because they already use ETH for certain transactions, uh, and that might not be the most sustainable chain to not bankrupt the country at the end of the day. That's super interesting that that's the case. I mean, that's also an episode I think that we can really dive into kind of the adoption by governments, like how can it change the way that we tokenize assets, be it like, certificates of degrees and school grades, etc.
Yep.
All the
Yeah.
way to like owning land and all of that. Since we are at the hour, and I'm excited to keep some of these also for future episodes, maybe just a quick answer to what excites you most about Web3 and like, yeah, why are you here and why are you still here even though there's no more money to be made.
Yeah. No, I think we are all like everyone that's here and everyone that's watching this. We are still very very early. I know that it's not the best time that we're having at the moment in terms of when we refer to bull and bear markets, we are pretty bare at the moment, and the sentiment is pretty low. But in terms of myself, if we think back to history, and just recent history, actually, in the grand scheme of things, the 2000 was the dot-com bubble, right? As we know it, the dot-com bubble, and that wave of the Amazon and the Googles and all that, it all came out of that dot-com bubble, and I was back then. I was too young. That's my excuse. I was too young to understand how economies work, how market cycles work, and how things get adopted and what the adoption curves look like over a longer period of time. I see very much Web3 being the next .com, if you like, and Web3 encapsulates also a certain extent, certain components to do with AI and all the things that are hot at the moment. Um, and personally, I'm not about to miss that because I know that if I did miss it, then I would regret it for the rest of my life, not being part of that adoption curve to then look back 10, 20 years from now and in 2023, we did this and we saw it coming. And it might not exactly play out and pan out to how we see it looking forward today, because, looking backwards is always 2020. But we can all be sure that there will be growth and the bear markets will turn to a bull market and then the bull market will turn to a bear market. But in terms of long term or even medium term, it always looks like this until 20 years later it might dip. But the adoption always looks like this for technology that is here to stay. So I firmly believe that as a bigger area encapsulated within Web3, Web3 is here to stay. Doesn't matter in what format and how we end up, perhaps we end up a lot more centralized than we originally thought, or even more decentralized than we all thought. Um, but Web3 is here, and it has sufficient infrastructure already inbuilt and sufficient adoption for it to then morph and proceed to grow a lot further. So for me, personally, it is that adoption potential and being part of that journey, even if it's just a very, very small piece, being that part of that journey to then grow whatever small piece or pieces we have into a lot bigger pieces, and seeing that potential in the long term, not in the short term, because if it's in the short term, then we'd all be gone. So long term is all I think about. I don't worry about prices. I don't worry about, hey, this dip, that dip. I mean, it's not always about the prices. The prices will come when the adoption comes and when the technology is mature. So if we put our focus on the fundamentals, in it for the tech, right? That's the meme. But that is also the truth. You gotta be in it for the fundamentals, and then the prices and all that, the financial gain, that's a byproduct and that's a result of the hard work, and that takes time.
We'll end it there. I guess in summary, we're early, right? And I think that that is
We are.
important to remember, that this remains true even though the markets might tell you that this is the end of the world. The technology really has not changed. So I'm really looking forward to
Mm.
discussing some more aspects in more depth in future episodes. I also thank you for getting up at 4:30 a.m. So it's still before 6 a.m. by my calculations in Australia. So thank you so much for taking the time and doing that. Really been a great, insightful episode.
No problem.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you everyone
Thanks for
for
having me.
thanks everyone for watching and staying with us. We are back this Wednesday, and we'll dive into kind of decentralized finance with a different guest, of a very interesting multi-chain wallet. Kind of discuss a little bit more in depth how decentralized finance is kind of shaking up these crusty systems, and also we'll probably talk a lot about personal responsibilities, keys, wallets, seed phrases, and all of that we've touched on.
Mhm.
But I'm really excited to have you back for the 102 episode of this, and then dive into some more of these foundational concepts that I think are really important to understand, in order to also understand why we're here, and why we're doing this, and why we still
Mm.
have the right to believe in this, and can still be excited about building these bridges that you always talk about. So thank you so much, Joe.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you very soon.
Thanks.